Welcome back to Realism Overhaul. Today our probe Raven 4 Mars 1 is arriving at Mars after a course correction later on. But before we get to that, there's something I mentioned in the previous episodes with a plethora of weather satellites going up into low Earth orbit and then returning science back to the Earth, all before the Mars flight even took off. However, they all returned afterwards, and I wanted them all in the same video. So we're going to get through the weather satellites before we get to our Mars things. These satellites are called Storm Chasers. Now these are carrying the rather large Planetary Photography 2 experiment, I believe it was called that, which has a total experiment runtime of 2 years. However, each one is only capable of completing 20% of that 2-year mark. So I am launching up 5 of these, and while the first one ended up having a second engine failure, which means we actually had to launch 6 Storm Chasers. These satellites have to be placed in a rather specific orbit, although it is a little bit lenient, considering, well, how low of an orbit it is. But it's an orbit that is somewhere around 400 kilometers. I think it had to be below like 400 something kilometer orbit, and the eccentricity had to be pretty much 0. But luckily, you don't really even need a circularized orbit that low around the Earth for eccentricity to be that low. So it worked out rather nicely, and I aimed for around 400 kilometers. Now, a few of these launches ended up having a failure on the Juno engine, the upper stage engine, which has 3 ignitions. The first ignition places it into its orbit, which is not circularized. The second burn, if it does not fail, looks to circularize the orbit around 400 kilometers. And the reason I was attempting that even was because of one contract, the first WeatherSat, which wanted a very circular orbit. And actually, now that I'm saying this out loud, the eccentricity requirements are not for that experiment. They are only for that contract, which I was trying to do at the same time. So anyways, back to the ones that failed one of the 3 ignitions. I think we had 2 or 3 of the 5 actually have an engine failure while trying to circularize. And the final ignition, the 3rd ignition, had to be for re-entry. That final burn was to bring the entire satellite back down from low Earth orbit on a return trajectory. And then basically the science from the photography experiment would be transferred to a small re-entry capsule at the front of the satellite, which would then be sort of shot off like a cannon to bring the science safely back home via parachute. Unfortunately, the very first Storm Chaser re-entry, I neglected to do this in a place where we had connection. Now, last episode we did launch up a small array of ComSats. However, the ones that were temporary are actually already dead and no longer providing, well, connection in low Earth orbit. So this was done in a place where we had no connection, and I could not manually jettison the capsule, bringing the science back home. So this first satellite, the entire thing went down altogether, and just luckily it didn't completely disintegrate, and we were actually to return this science safe and sound back home. Now, a lot of the Storm Chaser missions actually went pretty much along these lines, well, except for the first launch, which didn't even make it to orbit, but apart from that, the other 5, well, except for one, was able to shoot this capsule like a cannon back home safe and sound. One of them had 2 engine failures of the Juno. First, it failed upon circularizing at 400 kilometers, but was still able to do the science experiment for the 6 months or so perfectly fine. But then when it came time to re-enter, another failure and the 3rd ignition was eaten up. Now this was, let me see here, Storm Chaser 3, I believe. So it was stuck in orbit, not able to bring the science back home. However, we did have RCS on the craft. it was just a problem with actually all of these storm chasers. We have 2 small RCS ports on the rear end of the spacecraft. However, only one of them ever worked. And so we had just one tiny RCS thruster offset from the center of mass, trying to push us down into the atmosphere. Luckily, we did have enough fuel. Hydrazine is actually incredibly efficient RCS fuel, and we were using that in the single RCS port. Took about 7 different passes trying to burn retro at our apogee to bring us back home, but it took so long, and I didn't put any of the footage into this video. If for whatever reason you would like to see that occur, I believe the VOD is still up on the Twitch channel, which, by the way, I stream this save every Tuesday and Thursday in the afternoon CST. So if you ever want to see some non-edited, just everything that goes on in the mission, that's where you'd find it. But I didn't want to put that in the video just because of how much time it would take, and, well, I didn't really think it would be all that interesting to display. Other than that and the first launch, Storm Chaser went off without a hitch, and we got a lot of science. I think 200 science total from all of these missions, which was absolutely incredible. And this science was immediately dumped into getting towards capsules. Well, first getting an RL-10 engine to help with our lunar lander build, which we should see in a few episodes, absolutely. But more so to unlock capsules, because we are making our way towards better manned flight. Now on screen, we have our Mars correction burn. This was Raven 4, Mars 1, I believe 163 days. No, actually, it was initially planned for 163 days, but this actually occurred 158 days after liftoff. This brought our periapsis around Mars as low as I wanted to go. I could have probably gone lower, but I wasn't really sure about Mars' atmosphere until I got here. So our plan was to fly by and put our periapsis around 118 kilometers, and this dipped us 7 kilometers into Mars's atmosphere for, well, some good old science purposes. So 255 days after launch, Raven 4 Mars 1 arrives at Mars. Although entirely unplanned, we ended up flying by Mars above the Valles Marineris, what I believe to be the largest canyon in our solar system. I did plan a flyby around sunset of Mars, did a little math to figure out where the Terminator would be. I was a little bit off, but we did end up with a day flyby, which I thought was absolutely incredible. So here we're dipping into the atmosphere, and someone on the Twitch suggested that I try to light the engine to slow down just a little bit. We had hardly any fuel remaining, around 300 meters per second of delta V, but I figured why not. So we tried to light the engine at our lowest point in the atmosphere, and we ended up having another failure with this Juno upper stage engine. Nonetheless, our flyby mission was completely successful. All onboard experiments are complete for Mars Space High and Mars Space Low, and we got just a little bit of science from Mars atmosphere as well. Overall, this flyby netted us 121.9 science, which will definitely be useful towards getting our manned spaceflight programs up and running. 6 months after we launched the Mars probe, we ended up launching another one towards Venus, which is on its way currently. And even though we launched that before we had the Mars flyby, we will see the launch of our Venus probe and hopefully its successful arrival around Venus in the next episode, as well as a new ComSat array. But with that, I want to thank you guys so much for watching, and peace out.